I wish everyone who read the book read it as carefully as you have, Tim. That's right. That's exactly what we were trying to do.
And now, ladies and gentlemen, Binnall of America Audio, with your host, Tim Binnall.
Hello there, my friends. This is Tim Binnall of BinnallofAmerica.com with another edition of Binnall of America Audio, Season 2. It is April 21st, 2007. We are back from our little spring break. Hope you didn't miss us too much, and I hope you are ready for more underground, esoteric interviews, as only you can find here on BOA Audio. This week we have a very cool episode for you. I think it will go down as one of the more memorable interviews that we've ever done here on the program. Our guest is Tony Healy, co-author of The Yowie, In Search of Australia's Bigfoot. And he comes to the program direct from Australia. This interview literally spanned 2 continents and 2 days, as we recorded it on a Friday night here in America, and it was Saturday morning in Australia. In this conversation, we're going to talk about the evolution of the Yowie in Australia, from Aboriginal reports to colonial settlers seeing the Yowie, a strange blackout of Yowie news for about 75 years, and then a Yowie renaissance in 1975 in Australia, plus some intriguing modern-day reports of civilization butting up against Yowie territory, the other mysterious cryptid in Australia, the Jungidi. What is the Jungidi, and what's the difference between the Jungidi and the Yowie? You're going to find out from Tony Healy. Interesting trends and characteristics of the Yowie, the paranormal elements of the Yowie, and, of course, tons and tons more. This is a jam-packed interview. For those of you who are unfamiliar with Tony Healy, let me give you a little bit of background on him. Canberra-based Tony Healy became involved in Yowie research in the mid-1970s. Since 1981, he and Yowie co-author Paul Cropper have collaborated on many projects, notably in co-authoring Out of the Shadows, Mysterious Animals of Australia, which contained a lengthy chapter about the elusive Yowie. Over the past 30 years, they have searched for lake monsters, hairy giants, out-of-place big cats, and other semi-legendary animals in Fiji, North America, the Bahamas, Iceland, Ireland, Great Britain, Nepal, Malaysia, and every state and territory in Australia. You can find out more on Tony Healy at the website yowiefile.com, yowiefile.com. Without any further ado, let's rock and roll. This interview was recorded on March 16th, 2007, direct from Canberra, Australia. Tony Healy, talking about the Yowie on Binnall of America Audio, Season 2.
I wish everyone who read the book read it as carefully as you have, Tim. That's right. That's exactly what we were trying to do. Binnall of America.
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 Binnall of America Audio.
There was a young fellow who told us an awful lot about his clan's interaction and knowledge of the hairy man. But one thing he wouldn't tell us was the word they used for the hairy man in his tribe. He said that this word was a word you had to say if you happened to meet one face to face. That was supposedly what you said. Now, the effect of that word, I don't know. Perhaps it was a greeting, or perhaps it was some kind of magic incantation. I'm just not sure.
And now, ladies and gentlemen, Binnall of America Audio, with your host, Tim Binnall.
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to another edition of Binnall of America Audio, and we have just a very special edition of the program for you this week. Our guest is Tony Healy, and he's coming to us direct from Australia. He's the co-author with Paul Cropper of The Yowie, In Search of Australia's Bigfoot. Tony Healy, welcome to the program.
Nice to be here, Tim.
Like I said, I'm just really excited to have you on the program. I checked out this book, The Yowie, In Search of Australia's Bigfoot, about in the last month or two, and it is amazing. I cannot speak highly enough of it. It is just one of the best cryptozoology books I've read in such a long time, and a fascinating look at a branch of esoterica in another country that really opens your eyes to, the whole sociology of what's going on there. I give it the highest recommendation I can. I hope all of the Binnall of America audio listeners check out the book, The Yowie, In Search of Australia's Bigfoot. And now we got you on the program to talk about it. I'm so excited. Let's start out first with your bio and the background and all that good stuff, and how you gravitated toward the paranormal and the esoteric, and how your journey began.
Well, yes, that's going back a fair way now, Tim. I'm almost 62 years old, and so I think it was about 50 years ago. I was about 12 years old, and I picked up a book on the Loch Ness Monster in our local library. It was More Than a Legend by Constance White, and that got me quite excited. I thought one of these fine days I'd like to go to Loch Ness, and ultimately I did. I've been there about 4 times, but after that I glimpsed a strange animal in North Queensland one time while driving. Not tremendously exciting. It looked like an American puma. Of course, they're not supposed to exist in Australia. I just wasn't entirely sure whether I'd imagined it, but I learned later that there had been many sightings in that area of similar creatures. So that was probably something that kicked me along. And then in 1969, I was working in Canada, in British Columbia, in logging, a logging camp up near Terrace, BC, and also around Pitt Lake. And in both places, I heard stories of the Sasquatch. And it took me a long while to realize that the guys up there were serious. Some of them knew people who'd seen these creatures. And, of course, that got me quite excited, and I sometimes took a little plastic camera that I had at the time and wandered off into the trees on the weekends, but didn't see anything. And then when I returned to Australia, I was then about 30 years old. Oh, no, wait on, I'm getting ahead of myself. There was a trip to Loch Ness in the meantime there. But to cut a long story short, in 1978, I went on a 2-year round-the-world trip looking for the Sasquatch in North America for about 11 months there, and then on to Scotland to revisit Loch Ness, then to the Himalayas and also to the Malay Peninsula looking for yetis and yeti-like creatures. And on my return to Australia, I slowly gathered information on a Bigfoot-like creature here, the Yowie. So around that time I ran into Paul Cropper, and between us we've researched many Australian cryptozoological mysteries, and we put together a lot of that information in our first book, Out of the Shadows, Mystery Animals of Australia, 1994 that one was. And since then we've been working on the book about the Yowie, which you mentioned, and thanks for your kind words about it. Yes, in that more than 10 years, we've put together all our information on the Yowie, and this book is the result of that work.
Yeah, like I said, it's just an outstanding book. Just well put together, amazing case files in there, just a wealth of material, and just tremendous. I just really enjoyed it a tremendous amount. And you can get the book, obviously, at Amazon.com, of course, and it's via Anomalist Books, and you can find out more there at anomalistbooks.com. Those are the places where you can go to get Yowie, In Search of Australia's Bigfoot. Amazing book. Let's just dive right in here now to the Yowie mystery. before we even sort of like delve into the history of the Yowie in Australia and all that stuff, let's bring people up to date on what exactly the Yowie is. And I guess the best description would be, as the title of the book suggests, Australia's Bigfoot. But of course, there's much, much more to it than that. Tell the audience about the Yowie and describe it and what it is.
Yes, Tim. Well, as far as we know, to judge from all eyewitness accounts, and Paul Cropper and I, between us, have interviewed 120 eyewitnesses, and we have, on top of that, another 200 or so reports from colonial times and so on. It seems that people are describing something very much like the American Sasquatch or Bigfoot. We can't say for sure because nobody can say anything about these creatures for sure. But to go from the top of the head down to the ankles, it seems that there may be a sagittal crest or something, some feature on the top of the head. So it's because often people say the head was sort of dome-shaped, but rather pointy, like perhaps a man in a hooded coat, a stiffly, like a church door effect, or a football shape with a kind of a point on the top, but not greatly so. Just a suggestion of a pointed top to the head. Then the other thing that is constantly mentioned is that the head rests straight on the shoulders without benefit of neck. That is almost 100% of eyewitnesses and Aboriginal law says that. Somehow or other they can still turn their head to look at you, but it seems as if the head is set straight into the shoulders. Frequently they say the head looks small compared to the shoulders or to the body in general. The shoulders are wide, they're very wide, but perhaps sloping at the same time to some extent. The arms are very long. Some people say they were somewhat below, the hands were below the knees. Often they say the hands were down about to the knees. The posture's a little slumped forward in many cases, so people say, well, the arms perhaps wouldn't have been quite so long had the thing been standing up dead straight. In general, they look like, you might say, a gorilla with long legs in proportion, the same proportion as the humans. Long, strong legs, very thick body. The torso often is said to be the same width almost all the way down. On other occasions it's said to taper somewhat. The hands appear to be human-like. Those few people who've had a good look at the hands say that they appear to be five-fingered. The nails or claws appear to be quite long in some cases, fearsomely long occasionally, people say. So the thumbnail sketch we have of the Yowie is pretty consistent from the top of the head down to the ankles. The face is said to be either the face of an ape-like man or a man-like ape. Aborigines say these things are men, but they're hairy ape-like men. Europeans or non-Aborigines, that's a bit of a 50-50 situation. Some say they're more ape-like and some say they're more man-like. Almost always the skin is said to be coppery brown, black to coppery brown, rather dark anyway. The hair often covers almost all the face, right up to just below the eyes, so some people can't make a call on the colour of the skin at all. Sometimes there is said to be the upper canines are said to be very prominent and even protruding below the bottom lip when the mouth is closed. The only area where things get very vague and funny is below ankle level, where the shape of the feet is very difficult to establish. We get a lot fewer track finds in Australia than you do in North America. A lot fewer, because I think the ground is dry and stony compared to North America. There's very little snow. And, but even so, it seems strange that we have so few good plaster-cast footprints. We have some five-toed ones that look reasonably okay. We have other more bizarre shapes, but we could get into that later. But the here's a quote by an old Aboriginal elder from the South Coast, interviewed in 1954. Their word for the Yowie was doolagal, because there were many different Aboriginal terms for the Yowie. Mm-hmm. He says, a doolagal is a gorilla-like man. He has long, spindly legs. He has a big chest, long arms. His forehead goes back from his eyebrows. His head goes into his shoulders, no neck. And he goes on to say where they live down there. But, yeah, that's about the strength of it. Something like a Bigfoot or a Yeti.
Except for the strange feet. We'll talk about the bizarre foot situation in a little bit, but that is one of the most compelling aspects of the Yowie mystery. I'm telling you, this I'm really in love with the Yowie now. I've enjoyed this book so much.
You must come out here, and if you come out here someday, we'll give you a tour of some of the Yowie areas.
I think a Yowie hunt may be on the agenda, definitely.
Well, you're always welcome.
Talk a little bit about the evolution of the Yowie in Australia and how the Aborigines, it's not just a modern sort of thing. It was around with the Aborigines and evolved over time, and it's been going on since the good old days, if you will.
Yes, certainly has, Tim. As far as we can establish, virtually every Aboriginal clan from Cape York Peninsula in the north right down to Victoria in the south believe strongly in the existence of these creatures. And when you talk to the Aborigines about it, they say, well, our people have always believed in these creatures. The creatures have always been here. One or two Aboriginal legends specifically say that these creatures were here before the Aborigines got here. So they certainly do believe in them. There's cave art in Cape York depicting the Yowie. We have a photograph of one cave painting in the book, and there are legends of handed down over God knows how many years of Aborigines engaging in sporadic warfare with these big hairy giants. Wow! Presumably over possibly millennia or at least hundreds of years, and resulting in the Yowies withdrawing into the least accessible rocky forested mountains. So, and the Aboriginal descriptions of the Yowie are very similar. They match really well the descriptions given by modern non-Aboriginal eyewitnesses today.
And what's fascinating, too, is that these, obviously the legends of the Yowie were in existence with the Aborigines. And then when the Europeans started coming to Australia, they had their own Yowie sightings. In some cases, they had heard about the Yowie beforehand when they had run into the Aborigines. And in other cases, they hadn't really heard about it. But it brings a sort of different element into it that now when the Europeans came, the Yowies, that didn't go away. It wasn't something that you'd think if it was a made-up tribal thing that no one would see it, but it turns out when these Europeans came, they started having Yowie sightings.
Yes, that's the most exciting thing, I think, that the colonial era pioneers described the same sort of thing. Paul, my colleague, Paul Cropper, he's very good at digging up early reports, and we have eyewitness reports dating back to 1847. We have strong rumours prior to 1847 of sightings by non-Aborigines. Certainly some naturalists and officials in New South Wales were talking about these creatures earlier, and people were writing about them, writing about Aboriginal beliefs in them anyway, as early as the mid-1820s. So, yes, it goes back a long way.
And then what I found really fascinating, too, was it seems like once Australia sort of got settled as a... I'm not familiar with the country, with the evolution as far as the country of Australia, so I may be wrong about when it got established. But
sure.
From about the 1900, from around 1900 to 1975, as you guys point out in the book, there seemed to be just a complete lack of Yowie information, Yowie sightings. Yowie sort of fell completely off the radar in Australia for a very long period of time. Talk about what that was all about and why you think that happened, and sort of how it came out of the doldrums there.
Yes, that was odd. For many years, Paul and I used to talk about the forgotten years or some such phrase. We couldn't work out why there seemed to be a lot of reports through the colonial era, which ended in 1901 when the states got together to form Australia, the Federation. Somewhere around about there, from there through to about 1975, which seems a very precise date, but there's a reason for that. For those first 75 years of the 1900s, there was actually no reports that we could find. We had one or two or three, but nowadays we have more because of Paul's research, but and for other reasons. But I think the reason why there was sort of a silence that came down in those years was that ironically in the early 1900s a lot of people were drifting from the outback to the cities or the towns. Mm-hmm. I think it was because of mechanisation of farming. They needed not so many people in the rural areas, and a lot of villages and small towns in the rural areas became ghost towns, partly because of that depletion of population in the rural areas, and partly because of the end of the gold rushes. During the mid-1800s, there were hundreds of thousands of people wandering around all over the countryside looking for gold and hearing stories about the hairy man or the Yowie. But after the gold rushes ended, the big gold rushes ended about 1890. Another factor, I think, was tragically the Aborigines at that time were pretty well defeated in frontier wars, like as in North America with the Native Americans. And a lot of the Aborigines in southeastern Australia had their world completely destroyed. In some cases, they lost their language and even their names. They were confined to reservations, partly for good reasons. I think they were at least safe from the worst kind of frontier outlaw type people there. But they were in the early 1900s and in the mid 1900s, when I was growing up, there was very little contact between Aborigines and most non-Aborigines. They were kind of out of sight and out of mind, and I think they kept a lot of things to themselves. They thought, well, if they mentioned a hairy man to some people, they'd be laughed at, and besides which, there is a kind of a taboo element about the hairy man law in Aboriginal society. Some Aborigines don't like to talk about it at all. But, yes, in those years too, it was a funny time. Although the modern era was coming on, the road system in the outback was just terrible. I mean, people didn't go out there for recreation much because your car would fall apart, It was a huge adventure for me, even in the early 1960s, to go all the way up to Darwin and over to Western Australia and places like that. And it was pretty primitive, you know. There were no four-wheel drives. People didn't go out there. And, of course, a lot of country newspapers in that era folded up along with the small towns that they served. So we had mainly big city newspapers, which perhaps, if they received stories on the Yowie, perhaps didn't want to feature them. They just couldn't believe them. So perhaps that's the story, Tim. I don't know.
And then something strange happened in 1975, as you sort of allude to, and that was this explosion of the Yowie Renaissance, if you will. Talk about what precipitated that, what caused this Yowie Renaissance, and what the mood was like as far as the cryptozoology community, which seemed to be sort of, it was like a birth almost of the cryptozoology community when this Yowie Renaissance happened. So let's talk a little bit about that.
For sure. Yes. Well, I guess most credit should go to just one guy for that, Rex Gilroy, who in about 1974, 75, began to write articles for popular magazines in Australia and sometimes for the tabloids. He was based in the Blue Mountains, which is a really, really wild area to the west of Sydney. And he'd heard of Yowie stories since he was a kid. And then he had an experience in 1970 where he saw a Yowie walking across a small clearing in the Blue Mountains. So Rex went public and appealed for information about these creatures. And a lot of people responded, evidently. I have a couple of large files about Rex's his articles and the responses. I met him at that time because I had only just begun to collect one or two Yowie stories then. I've heard one from the colonial era near Canberra here, and one from the far south coast of New South Wales, which was supposedly ongoing. But ironically, I was saving madly to go overseas to look for the Bigfoot Sasquatch in North America and to carry on to the Himalayas and so on. And I just found it, well, I just couldn't get my mind around the idea that there could be similar creatures in Australia, because I had worked in almost every state of Australia, every state and territory of Australia prior to that, in remote areas. And apart from those two instances I mentioned, I'd never heard a thing about the Yowie, not a single thing. And to suddenly have this sort of inkling in the mid-70s that there could be something, I just couldn't believe it. And I talked to Rex, but he didn't offer any documentation for his claims. And I thought, well, he must be, I just can't believe this. I put it aside for 2 years until I returned from overseas. In that same time, around just before I left for overseas, 1977, Graham Joyner, who is an archivist here in Canberra at the National Archives, a very serious, erudite fellow, a scientist, totally different really from Rex. Graham put out a little 26-page booklet, which was actually jam-packed with early references to the Yowie, or hairy man, as it's often called. He'd stumbled over these early references in the National Archives, and his book appeared as virtually as I had my air ticket in my hand, ready to go overseas looking for the Bigfoot. But I got together with Graham, and I thought, well, there is something to this. I guess I'll check it out when I get home. But certainly between 1975 and 1980, a small number of people, such as myself and Paul Cropper and Graham and Rex, were starting starting to collect stories, and then in more recent years, with internet and microfiche and all that stuff, Paul has been able to delve back into those forgotten years prior to 1975, and now we have quite a few stories from the 1920s, 1930s, 1940s, and 50s, and so on. So we filled in those years, and we've both been lucky enough to go and interview some of the old timers who were still alive. So we have
awesome,
more or less filled in that blank. Yes,
it's really that's fascinating about just how it sort of became, I don't know, sort of just began then in 75. It's really a strange situation in a way.
Yeah.
And so would you say that today, in the modern day field in general sort of is similar in a way to the American cryptozoology scene, where you now at least have people who are investigating this and are taking reports and are actively looking for the Yowie and that sort of thing?
Yes, it's very similar now, in my experience. Yes, we have some very well organised groups, such as Australian Yowie Research, AYR. They have their own website. Dean Harrison, a good friend of ours who helped us a great deal with reports for our book, he has an organisation. I think he's got about 40 people.
Wow.
in various states, from Queensland to Victoria, and they go out with. Dean is a fairly wealthy guy, and he has got an awful lot of high-tech equipment, infrared devices and so on and so forth. And they go out in camouflage gear, with the four-wheel drives and so on. And they put in a fair bit of time out there. They really give it their all, because and they've come up with some interesting stuff. Dean got interested because he had a particularly hair-raising encounter with a Yowie himself in the hinterland behind the Gold Coast in Queensland. I think in 1996, he was chased by a particularly cranky Yowie that seemed intent on ripping him limb from limb.
Oh, wow.
So it would have reduced me to jelly, but Dean's made of sterner stuff. He just wanted to get to the bottom of the mystery after that. And
one of the sort of sub-questions here I wanted to ask you about was that came up a couple times in the book, and you alluded to it just now when you were discussing the Aborigines, and that was that there's sort of a taboo aspect where they don't want to talk about it, or they'll tell you some things and then they'll be like, well, we can't tell you anything else though, or what, we can't, that there's things that about the Yowie that have to remain a secret, and that kind of strange sort of thing. And this is like a two-part sort of question coming out of that thought. First of all, why do you think they have that attitude? And the B part is, what do you think they're not telling us about the Yowie that maybe would shed some light on all this?
Yes, well, I hope I can give some sort of coherent response to that. It's because it's something we had to sort of be careful with in the book. We had to respect Aboriginal tradition and try and spell out their beliefs. Yes, it's strange. Some Aborigines. This has been reported by anthropologists and so on since the colonial era, and our own experience reflects this, that some Aborigines refuse to talk about the Yowie at all. They'll just change the subject or turn their back or say, oh, no, rubbish, never heard of it. I talked to one Aborigine. I worked with him briefly down the coast, the south coast of New South Wales, in an area that I know all Aborigines, if not 90% of white people, believe in the Yowie. And I raised the subject with him, and he said, no, never heard of it. So he just didn't want to talk about it. Others will talk about it reasonably freely, and some, as you say, will say yes. Well, there are certain things about it, like for instance, the name in the Gudgeonborough clan in northeastern New South Wales. There was a young fellow, Kyle Slab, who told us an awful lot about his clan's interaction and knowledge of the hairy man. But one thing he wouldn't tell us was the name that they called, the word they used for the hairy man in his tribe. He said that this word was a word you had to say if you happened to meet one face to face. That was supposedly what you said. Now, the effect of that word, I don't know. Perhaps it was a greeting, or perhaps it was some kind of magic incantation. I'm just not sure, but he wouldn't tell us that. Ironically, when he first met a Yowie face to face, that word was the last thing in his mind. He just screamed and turned and ran. He said, and it was only later he remembered the tribal law. Yes, let me see. The Aboriginal law about these things. They generally, what they convey to me is that the creatures are real. That is, you can touch them, or they can grab you, or they might even grab a child and run off with it, either to eat it or kill it or something. And they certainly have been seen many times killing kangaroos and grabbing food out of campsites and so on. Yet at the same time, there's something spiritual about them, something uncanny. One Aborigine said to me in so many words, I said, well, how would you go about, could you photograph, or how would you go about catching one of these things? She said, oh no, they're real, but you can't catch them. You can't catch them. They're real, but you can't catch them. I've heard similar things many times. Even though, I was born and raised in Australia, and I've worked with Aborigines, and I'm interested in their culture and so on, and written a little bit about them, I don't pretend to know everything about them at all. And Paul, in fact, Paul Cropper is part Aboriginal, although he was raised by white people. But so he's lost his any direct knowledge there. But I don't pretend to really have a grip on the Aboriginal mindset about what is real and what is not, if you know what I mean.
Yeah.
I think their view, to generalise greatly, I think the Aboriginal worldview is a bit different from ours in that the line between the real world and the spirit world is a lot fuzzier. They, possibly it's the same with many Native Americans, they see, for one thing, they appear to see a spiritual side to everything, like every rock and every tree and every breath of air and drop of pollen has some kind of spiritual aspect, which actually I agree with myself, but I can't feel it, except on rare occasions. Whereas I think with them, particularly the ones who still live in the tribal structure, I think their view of what's real and what is not is different from ours. So they would naturally, I think, see some spiritual aspects to the Yowie, because after all, they see spiritual aspects to crows and kangaroos. But nevertheless, I think there's something about the Yowie that, they don't have a taboo about talking about kangaroos, for instance. There's something awfully scary and awfully strange, I think, about the Yowie. Call me superstitious, and perhaps this is jumping ahead a little in the conversation here, but I often think there's something rather uncanny about the Yowie. I'm not sure what it is, but I kind of think the Aborigines might be onto something.
And in the book, you do a great job of sort of outlining what would be called the Yowie hotspots, and you talk about the various parts of Australia that seem to have a lot of Yowie sightings. And one of the aspects of the book that I did like a lot is that you address any sort of criticism before someone could make it, in a way, where you say, you know, these are Yowie hotspots, but they might be Yowie hotspots because we have a lot of investigators there. I have a lot of respect for that, instead of just leaving that open-ended so in case someone could come along and say exactly what you just said. You know what I mean? I appreciate that you address potential problems in your points, which is really awesome.
Yeah. I wish everyone who read the book read it as carefully as you have, Tim. That's right. That's exactly what we were trying to do. We were anticipating, you know, people's questions.
Exactly.
Queries, yeah.
And one of the points that I wanted to make about these Yowie hotspots is that you sort of make in the book, and you and Paul obviously make in the book, is that there's these situations here, what I dub as the neighborhood Yowies, where there's families, and you have a couple of interesting cases in there with the Frost family and the O'Connor family, where they live sort of close to the border here between, as the cities expand and get closer into the wild part of Australia, there's sort of a fuzzy border there, and the people on the edge and in these hotspots is where there are these situations where there's a lot of interaction with the Yowie. Can you talk about those cases of the neighborhood Yowies, as I call them?
Yes, certainly, Tim. Yeah, that's right. There are a few places, such as the Gold Coast hinterland, where the city is expanding rapidly and the western edge is hitting some, well, inaccessible jungly areas, and also down in the Blue Mountains west of Sydney, where the city of Sydney has expanded westward and just run head-on into the escarpment of the Blue Mountains, which is an area of thousands and thousands of square miles, tens of thousands of square miles of ravines and jungle-covered cliffs, as wild as any country you can get. And the city of Sydney is then funneled down into essentially one road that runs through the Blue Mountains, and there are settlements along that road, and hundreds of people, hundreds and hundreds of houses in those settlements back directly onto this just amazing wilderness that stretches for hundreds of kilometres north and south. So the Frosts and the O'Connors are two such families. They live, their backyards front onto this wilderness. Neither of them coincidentally have a back fence, so their property ends where the jungle begins. Since the mid-1980s, Neil and Sandy Frost have had, well, as we know now, Yowies occasionally visiting their property, coming up and staring through the windows or bashing the side of the house or stealing the dog food. For 8 years, the Frosts simply couldn't believe that this was going on. They knew that the footfalls were much too heavy for a human, and that whatever this creature was, it could charge through thick, thorny scrub in the middle of the night with no illumination. A human would get torn to shreds running around there at night. Eventually, however, they started to glimpse this creature. It seemed to be mainly one individual, which they called Fatfoot, because it had this sort of strange-looking footprints. They found footprints on 2 occasions. On the first occasion, it was actually very early in the time they were there. They'd just cleared their block to begin building the house, and there were clear footprints, a line of clear footprints in the soil. At that time, that was their very first experience. They just assumed someone was joking, that someone was walking around with big feet or something. So although they looked at the footprints, 8 years later, when they started to take the phenomenon seriously, they couldn't remember the exact shape of the footprints that had been there. The footprints that have appeared since have been less clear, but they have this funny, well, rather, fat look about them, to use their term. But anyway, yes, every member of the family, the two parents and the boy and the girl have all seen the Yowie now. Neil is quite an ingenious fellow. He's a school teacher with a scientific bent, and he's rigged up cameras with tripwires. He's rigged up a infrared triggered camera. He's gone out hundreds on hundreds of occasions with cameras at night and in the daytime looking around. He's managed to get 2 photographs, which he believes, and I think he's right, that both of these do show the Yowie, but as he cheerfully admits, neither photograph would convince anyone who's inclined to be sceptical, because they're just too indistinct. One simply shows glowing eyes, which a skeptic would say, well, it's a possum or something like that. But Neil knows that he was advancing on this creature and it was backing away. He could hear the big footsteps and other noises associated with them when he took the photograph. The other one was taken by his infrared camera, and when viewed under optimum conditions, that is, blown up on a colour TV monitor, you can see it looks like a black non-human face staring around a sapling, staring around a tree at him. But we couldn't use it in our book because, try as we might, when we converted it to black and white and reduced it to the size for the book, it just became a, what's that term?
Rorschach?
Rorschach, yes. So we thought it best not to use that. But yes, Neil's still trying. Every second week he phones up and says, well, they're back. He thinks the original one is now dead or gone. There seems to be a younger, slightly smaller one wandering around his street. In his street, there are about 30 households where people have actually seen these creatures or had chickens killed or pets carried off or dog food removed. So it's an ongoing thing. And then he lives on the northern edge of Blue Mountain settlement. On the southern edge of the same settlement, about 2 kilometres away, live the O'Connors, Jerry and Sue O'Connor. And ever since they've moved into their property in 1997, they've had very similar experiences. These incredible lion-like roars, like a cross between a lion, a bear, or something. People grope for terms to express the sound that these creatures can make when apparently they're threatened or enraged. The Frosts and the O'Connors have heard those vocalisations, which were also mentioned by pioneers during the colonial era in the Blue Mountains. And the O'Connors, however, have a slightly different take, or a rather different take on the phenomenon than the Frosts. Whereas the Frosts are convinced these things are just big flesh and blood creatures who can see in the dark, and who are very intelligent and elusive. The O'Connors, after a year or two of experiences, are now quite convinced that they're dealing with something that's paranormal in some way. As Jerry says, these creatures, they can read your bloody mind, he said. I'm sure of it.
One of the stories that I wanted you to talk about, because it was amazing, it's an amazing story, and I'm not sure off the top of my head if it was the Frosts or the O'Connors, but I'm pretty sure it was one of them, attempted to get some audio recording of the Yowie and hid an audio recorder And the result was an amazing story, and that's what I'd like you to tell now. And you put it in the book under Midnight Creeper. So, talk about the Midnight Creeper and the audio recording.
For sure. Well, Jerry O'Connor and his wife Sue has started to leave out food for their local neighbourhood Yowie, and they found that it appeared to like bread and peanut butter, amongst other things, different kinds of fruit, and the food was always taken. They of course they said, well, maybe possums had somehow got into these buckets that were suspended by wires from trees. So they started to string black cotton thread at a height of 6 feet from tree to tree horizontally around the area, and they found that this cotton thread was being broken when the food was being taken. So they assumed that it was the Yowie that was doing it. So on one occasion they got a voice-activated tape recorder and hid it in a stump, camouflaged it very carefully, just down the hill from their place on the edge of the forest. And they suspended a plastic bucket full of food from a tree that leant over a small cliff there, so that this bucket would be rather hard to get at, and it's an area where they themselves had glimpsed a Yowie in daylight, and a neighbour, Brad Croft, had seen one running across a track just downhill from there at night. But in any case, I've got a copy of the tape here, but the tape begins with the sound of Jerry saying, "Okay, I'm camouflaging the tape here. I'm moving away." You can hear his footsteps moving away, and then the tape is turned on once or twice by the sound of the wind and so on. And then through the Blue Mountains, alongside that road I mentioned, there is a railway, and coal trains move along there. And you can hear the sound of the coal train. I forget what time they'd indicated, but it was a handy time check for Jerry. The truth, it was the middle of the night, or very early in the morning in any case. And then you can hear what sounds like big footsteps, crunch, 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 coming towards the area. And then I'm just trying to remember the sequence here. I'm madly thumbing through the book to try and find the section, but there were a few things registered. There was a great thump, hollow thump, which they found later was the sound of the food bucket being hit by something. The food bucket was split and thrown several meters from where it was hanging. Well, a possum couldn't do that. A human possibly could, a hoaxer or whatever. But it's a funny area for anyone to be wandering around in the middle of the night. Mm-hmm. Rather dangerous on the edge of that cliff, and very few people have ever been seen down there. There's just no reason for anyone to be there. So the bucket was smashed and the food taken. Then there's the rustling sound of something messing around the area of the camouflage stump, the foliage being removed, and then what sounds like something clawing at the plastic-covered tape recorder. Yeah. And I'm trying to remember if somehow it managed to turn the thing off. But in any case, no, I don't think it did. I think it just ripped the plastic covering. ripped the plastic covering and strewed the foliage around a bit, and then wandered off. And there was later on the sound of another coal train indicating time frame, and I think in the morning a distant helicopter, and then the sound of Jerry approaching at 6 in the morning to check the tape. Well, Jerry showed me, he documented all this with photographs of the stump and so on prior to being discovered, and he maintains that nobody, even in broad daylight, would have been able to see anything in this stump. It was perfectly camouflaged, and at night, no human being would have been able to find it. But he says, well, the Yowie apparently its hearing was so acute that it could hear the tape operating in the stump. So that convinced Jerry, and he is one of these transparently honest individuals. I mean, of all the witnesses I've talked to, I'd put Jerry right up the top. He is a very honest man, and furthermore, he's adamant. He said he and his wife will willingly take lie detector tests to testify to everything that they've experienced, including this tape-recorded incident. And he swears on the grave of his child. He said, he's so adamant. He said, people must believe this, because he, prior to moving to that house, he had no idea about any of this business. He was a retired Navy veteran, over 20 years in the Navy, and he said the whole experience of interacting with this Yowie has spun his belief system on its heels.
To move on a little bit here, I want to talk about what I found to be some interesting trends, or maybe just interesting characteristics of the Yowie that I had never really heard about as far as an American Bigfoot. These, sort of maybe it even indicates that they're the same kind of animal but a different species or something. I'm not sure, but there were sort of different aspects to the Yowie that I was unfamiliar with and had not heard stand out in American cryptozoology. One of them I wanted to ask about was that the Aborigines said that the Yowie seemed to arrive after long periods of wet and stormy weather. Would you say that sort of holds up over the course of some of your case reports?
Yes and no. We did a statistical analysis as best we could with our 300 or so reports, and no, we couldn't find anything to suggest that Yowies are seen more in stormy weather than not. However, there are some cases that you think, there are some individual cases where, for instance, a small village down the south coast, not too far from where I am, where I've been many times, they've seen Yowies there repeatedly, and white people and Aborigines there both have said to me that these things, they said you should come back in the middle of a really, really rainy period. That's when these things turn up. They come out of the deep forest, and we're able to see them in the village or on the edge of the village. I interviewed an Aboriginal elder from northwest Western Australia, way the heck over there, one time, and he said that his people believe that the hairy man, I forget the local term they use, Jingara, I think, over there. The Jingara is seen in stormy weather, really stormy weather. And we have a case that was dug up by Graham Joyner years ago of Yowie being seen in the Tinderly Mountains just south of here, and the reporter said all the local people here say that these things are seen in stormy weather. That was white pioneers. So, and then there are a couple of other ones. So I think personally I think there may be something to this, but our database is just not extensive enough. And by the way, there are one at least, Bigfoot report that I know that seems to hint, or possibly, at this. There was a woman who saw one in Colorado not so long ago, and a big storm had just passed over when she saw hers. Anyway, I don't know. Perhaps we'll investigate that further.
And then another one of these aspects was this interest in children, sort of an interest in human children from the Yowie. What about that? Yeah. That sort of weird trend.
Yes, well, that's pretty much the same. The Aborigines in some areas certainly say that. One of the Aboriginal elders that Neil Frost got in touch with when he was trying to make sense of what was happening in the Blue Mountains, he immediately said, do you have children in your house? And Neil said, yes, we do. At that time, their kids were about 2 and 4 years old. And the little kids had seen one. And Neil said, why? And the guy said, well, they seem to be fascinated by children, or they have an interest in children. And of course, this frightened Neil. He thought, oh my God, were they going to run off with the kids or something? The guy said, oh, not necessarily, but there is some kind of affinity or something like that. And I've heard that from Aboriginal people myself. In some of the earlier reports from the 1930s, or dating back into the stories that were collected in the colonial era, Aborigines seem to be saying that sometimes children will be taken away and eaten by these things. So I just don't know, but that's the sort of anecdotal stuff I've heard and troubled belief. But once again, in our statistical analysis, for what it's worth, we haven't been able to establish that. I mean, certainly plenty of cases where children have been involved, but many more cases where men and women were involved.
Yeah, maybe I should have not called them trends instead of called them, strange characteristics.
Yeah. Oh, no, it's worth mentioning for sure, absolutely. I mean, wasn't it true with the Zunaqua, or in British Columbia, they used to call the Sasquatch the cannibal woman, or something like that? There was some similar belief that they might run off with children.
Perhaps. I'm not as well versed in Bigfoot as I used to be, I guess.
There's some of these to keep up with now, yeah.
Yeah. And another one of these weird characteristics that I'm sure you'll have a lot to say about is the biting of the trees. This strange trend or characteristic of trees being bitten into and grubs being taken out, and no discernible animal could be doing it possibly except for a bird, and that doesn't really make any sense either. And people think it is the Yowie because it's in Yowie country. Talk about this biting of the trees situation.
Yes, that's an interesting one. It's rather problematic because some Yowie researchers say no, we don't believe it, but others take it very seriously. Yes, it's in some of these Yowie hotspots, people have noticed that saplings, perhaps 4 inches in diameter, 4 to 6 inches in diameter or smaller, have been bitten by something that was quite evidently looking for wood-boring grubs. There's usually an indentation where a large grub had been right in the middle of this bite, and the grub has been removed. Well, something would need to have awfully strong jaws to do that. Nobody's seen a Yowie doing it, but people like the Frost swear that these bites have appeared overnight right on the edge of their property. And the only other candidate for making bites like that is the black cockatoo, which is a large bird with very strong beak, and they make very similar marks. Usually a lot messier though, and usually often extending from ground level right up to way above head height. Different kind of marks, sometimes very similar to these quote Yowie bites. But the bites that Neil Frost and others considered to be suspicious are always between about 4 feet and 6 to 7 feet from the ground, and they're spaced out along pathways between, well, not particularly well-marked pathways, but game trails between areas where yowies are seen frequently in the Blue Mountains. So, Neil and an outdoor educator fellow, Pat Ryan, plotted many of these tree bites using GPS and found that they ran out along areas, pathways connecting some of these yowie hotspots. It does appear, I'm inclined to believe that these bites are made by yowies, but it's an area where if you told an Australian naturalist who was sceptical about yowies, about these bites, he would say, forget it, they're just made by black cockatoos and that's that. But it's not quite that simple. One very experienced naturalist, Gary Opert, who probably knows more about Australian animals than virtually anyone, he's examined these bites, and he says no, they aren't black cockatoo bites. They are discernibly different. So yes, it's an odd one, but until someone actually sees a yowie biting one of these trees, I don't know.
Yeah. And the other interesting yowie trend characteristic that I want to talk about, which you alluded to earlier, of course, is the feet of clay, as you and Paul call it in the book. This bizarre foot situation where, despite all these great reports on the yowie, there seems to be no consensus on the situation with the foot, which is ironic in a sense because the American Bigfoot is famous for the foot, but the yowie is like the opposite, where we can't get a real bead on what's going on with the yowie feet. So talk a little bit about the yowie foot.
Yes, it's very strange, this. Aborigines, who, in the tribal era particularly, and even today in many areas, are fantastic trackers and woodsmen, seem to be rather vague about the shape of the yowie foot. I mean, they're quite unanimous about the general physical shape of the big hairy man. But the foot, well, in Cape York, up that way, they talk about the creatures having 3 toes with claws on the toes. Well, that seems strange because no primate, as far as we know, has 3 toes. Further south, well, I've talked to Aborigines who say, well, the tracks were like human tracks, only bigger. Well, that implies 5 toes. The implication in many Aboriginal stories that have been collected by other people, as far as I can see, is that mostly they seem to be implying that there are 5 toes. The tracks being bigger, of course. Mm-hmm. But and when it comes to non-Aborigines, well, in the colonial era, there are just a few cases where people actually looked at the feet while they were busy having the daylight scared out of them by moving these things. A couple of them actually had the presence of mind to look at the feet. And in one case, the surveyor who had, some time, perhaps a minute or so while the thing was standing by his campfire, he said that the toes were very long in proportion to the rest of the foot.
There's just general dispute about the situation with the feet. No one can really get a read on the number of toes, and even some of the Aboriginal legend says that the Yowie had backwards feet, which is even stranger.
Yeah, that is strange. Of course, it's a belief that exists in hairy man lore outside of Australia too. Mm-hmm. In the Himalayas, the Sherpas and other tribespeople often say that the Yeti's feet are reversed on its ankles, so that that it would baffle people trying to track it. In the Malay Peninsula, people told me the Orang Asli, the Aborigines down there, believe that the Orang Mawas or Orang Hitam, its feet are reversed on its ankles. And even bizarrely in Andros Island in the Bahamas, when I was there in 1979, investigating stories of the Yeho, the kind of medium foot, small Bigfoot type thing that's been reported there, the local people said, well, if you go down there looking for those things and you see the tracks going one way, you go the other way because the feet are reversed on the ankle.
Yeah.
So it's a funny thing, and it certainly crops up. It was recorded, that belief was recorded many times, up to, as far as I can gather, the 1940s or 50s or so in Australia. It was recorded many times. But I must say that in the modern era, when I've been interviewing Aborigines, I've never been told that by Aborigines myself. But it is a weird thing. Neil Frost, he says, well, maybe they, when confronted with a huge animal that they were frightened of and that was notoriously difficult to track, perhaps Aborigines pulled this idea of the reversed foot syndrome out of the air to sort of more or less explain why they couldn't catch these creatures.
Yeah. And one of the great things about the book, Yowie in Search of Australia's Bigfoot, that you and Paul Cropper co-wrote, I mean, you really synthesize a lot of the case reports and break it down in a chapter with a lot of graphs and charts, and I appreciate that a lot, too, because it's not just like, here's a bunch of case sightings. It's like we took case sightings and actually did something with them and tried to come to some kind of conclusions and figure out maybe trends and that sort of thing. So kudos to you and Paul for that for that chapter in the book.
Oh, yeah. Thanks, Tim. Yeah. Yes, it was a lot of work, that, and I hope we made some kind of sense out of it. We got some of those graphs surprised us, actually. We found that they actually, if you look at them, I guess from an impartial point of view, they do tend to suggest that this phenomenon is much more than hallucination or just mere folklore, because if people were imagining or hallucinating these encounters with Yowies, then you would think that they would see them nearly always at night.
Yeah.
And that there would be a solitary human witness. But in fact, that's not the case. There are 115 cases where there are more than one witness. In some cases, many witnesses at the one time. And there are basically almost the same number of sightings in daylight hours as at night, although, of course, there are many, many more people around during the daytime than at night. Interestingly, though, from dawn through to about 10 or 11 a.m., there are relatively very few sightings. The sightings pick up around 10 or 11 a.m. and increase through to dusk, and then carry on through till midnight and the very early hours of the morning, and then drop away to almost nothing towards dawn. So there is a pattern. There's a real pattern there. And the other unexpected thing was that there are many fewer sightings in summer than in the other seasons, which is very strange because as in North America, I guess, there are many, many more humans wandering around the forests in summer than there are in winter and so on. We have our school holidays in summer, and families have these four-wheel drives and so on. So, but there are discernibly fewer sightings in summer than the other seasons. So, yeah, quite a few interesting things were thrown up.
Yeah. And then another interesting creature that you discuss in the book that is not the Yowie, but is maybe somewhat related to the Yowie, is the and let me make sure I pronounce this right, the Junjidi, right?
Junjidi.
The Junjidi.
Yes. Well, that is pretty strange. After we'd been researching the Yowie for some years, trying to accumulate information to prove that there were these big, hairy, Yeti-like things, Sasquatch-like things in Australia, we started to collect stories of very small, hairy, man-like or ape-like creatures, about 3 feet tall. And at first we thought, well, obviously these things must be juvenile Yowies. But we started to notice that, well, for one thing, they weren't seen with adult Yowies, like big hairy men or big hairy women. And also we learned very early on that Aborigines, many different groups of Aborigines, I'm not saying every Aboriginal group in Australia because I don't know, but many Aboriginal groups believe that there are 2 different types of hairy sort of subhumans in Australia. That's not counting Europeans. They say that there are the big hairy men, Doolagals, Gubba, Jarrawara. They have many names for the big fellows, as they call them. But they say that there is this distinctly different type called Junjidi, or there are many variations on the word Junjidi and other terms in different areas like Nimbin and Winnambu and so on. So they say there are different types. Well, some researchers say, oh well, you know, the Aborigines just don't know what they're talking about. We couldn't possibly have 2 different types of undiscovered ape-like men running around in Australia. The little fellas must be the offspring of the big ones. But I think that it's foolish to disrespect or disregard centuries or thousands of years of Aboriginal law. So we just kept an open mind for a long time on that. By the time we got around to writing this book, though, we thought, well, perhaps the Aborigines are right, because there are certain things you've got to consider. As I said, these little hairy men are not seen usually, or virtually never at all, with the bigger ones. They're often seen in groups, well, in pairs or 3 or 4 together, all small. They are, and they're seen by Europeans as well as Aborigines. So there may be some other aspects which are slipping my mind right now, but there are some a few considerations. So we devoted a separate chapter to the Junjidi in this book, and one thing that perhaps could have some bearing on this is the recent discovery of small Junjidi-sized skeletons on Flores, the island in Indonesia, which is 700 kilometres. What's that? About 500 miles north of Australia. They were discovered in 2004, as you probably know. The small skeletons, which they call these people Homo floresiensis, the hobbits, and they have long arms. Their teeth are very big in comparison to their skulls, They're 3 feet tall. The present human inhabitants of Flores say that these creatures existed until 200 or 300 years ago, and according to tribal law, were covered from head to toe in hair. So, although there are no relics of Junjity-sized humans in Australia, Flores is pretty damn close to Australia, really, and in the Ice Age, when the sea levels were much lower, it's quite feasible that they could have found their way to Australia. In fact, Mike Morwood, the scientist who was the leader of the party that found this skeleton, he says he wouldn't be at all surprised. In fact, he would be surprised if these creatures didn't get to Australia. His theory, which he may be modifying a little at the moment, but at the time we wrote the book, his theory was that these small creatures on Flores were the descendants of Homo erectus, which were human-sized or larger creatures, Java man. The Homo erectus got to Flores 850,000 years ago, and then that's the last we know of them. But Mike Morwood and his crew speculated that finding themselves isolated on this small island, they, over 800,000 years, shrank to the size of hobbits because elephants that were also on the island also shrank to the size of water buffaloes or cows.
Huh.
So one theory that we just float, we put it out there in the book, is that we say, well, Mike Morwood says that the little hairy Homo floresiensis probably got to Australia. He also says that he would be very surprised if Homo erectus, the full-sized ancestor of the hobbits, he'd be very surprised if Homo erectus did not also get to Australia. Well, whereas the Homo erectus that stayed on Flores shrank, the ones that got to Australia could have increased in size, like some Homo erectus relatives did on mainland Asia.
Mm-hmm.
They grew in size. The ones that got to Australia would have been presented with this vast sort of feast of megafauna lumbering around everywhere, just begging to be slaughtered on the largest island on Earth, Australia. So they could have grown in size and become, shall we suggest, the Yowie. Later on, some of their smaller relations, the Homo floresiensis, could have got to Australia and become the Junjity. Well, this is just an idea we put forward. It's one of the, it's the best. If you want to believe the Yowies and the Junjities are flesh and blood, they have to come from somewhere, and this is as good a suggestion as we can think of.
Yeah, the Junjity chapter is amazing. It's an awesome addition to the book. I'm glad you guys decided to put it in there. It sounded like you were debating it for a little bit, but then decided, we got to include the Junjity, and I'm glad you did because the chapter is awesome, and we just scratched the surface here on the Junjity mystery.
Yeah, glad you liked it.
And then, sort of heading towards the big picture here, you guys come up with 4 conclusions on what the Yowie might be, and I'm amused by the way you listed them because you have A, B, and C, and then X. And A being not real, and we really don't need to discuss that because the evidence seems to point to not real. Well, actually, why don't you just talk about each of them and how you sort of dismiss some and agree with some and all that good stuff. The choices are not real, real but extinct, and then way down the list here at X is paranormal. And you guys seem to say that you probably don't think it's A or C, being not real or real but extinct. And you and Paul have your own sort of friendly disagreement on whether it's real or real and paranormal. So talk about sort of in all your years here of Yowie research, what do you think it's all about, and why do you think the other options aren't it?
Well, yes, let me see. That was a fairly good summary of what, yes, Well, I think it's possible for skeptics to make a fairly reasonable case to argue that the creatures have never existed at all, and that they are just an amalgam of Aboriginal myth, European superstition, mass hallucination, misidentification of feral human beings wandering around, hermits and so on, and just fear of the great unknown in Australia. Other aspects like that, or hoaxes as well. There have been one or two hoaxes, not very clever ones, but there was one that fooled some people for some time. So it is possible for a skeptic to make a reasonable case. Certainly they could convince themselves these things don't exist. But you can demolish that case. You can argue against that case quite convincingly. If humans are hallucinating when they see these creatures, then their livestock, their horses and their dogs and other animals are also hallucinating, because almost universally dogs and horses get extremely freaked out by the presence of Yowie. So, I mean, if Australian animals, like their benighted masters, also hallucinating, there are many other ways that you can address that suggestion that never existed. The uniformity of the descriptions and so on is one thing. But there are many other ways, and of course, eyewitnesses get extremely irate. They say, "Look, there were 6 of us. How in the hell could we have all hallucinated it?" And many people, several, like half a dozen at least or more, people specifically said that they'd never heard of the Yowie. Well, many more actually said that, but half a dozen were new migrants to Australia who'd never even heard of the wildest suggestion that there could have been such a thing here. So that's the first thing. Which, as you say, we tend to say, well, no, you can't argue that these things never existed. They must exist in some way.
Yeah, and you really don't even have to go into the argument that they're real, because that's the book in itself. I mean, the book is the argument that they're real. So
yes, all the evidence. Yowie nests, that's one thing. The discovery of these like primate nests, that's one thing that's quite physical, as well as the plaster caster footprints and so on. You were leading on there to
the real but extinct. I guess we really almost don't even have to discuss this, because we're talking about Yowie sightings that have occurred in the last few years and stuff. So obviously the extinct argument sort of goes out the window with the not real. So let's talk about the paranormal aspect of the Yowie, because that sounds like the fly in the ointment to the Yowie mystery in some ways.
Yes, that's right. As you intimated before, Paul Cropper and I we have agreed to more or less disagree on this point. I'm much more inclined to believe that these things are in some way uncanny or supernatural than Paul is. Mind you, I hope I'm wrong. I hope that they're just big, sort of Homo erectus or Java man lumbering around out there, and that one day we'll get a perfect photograph and so on. But there are, there's quite a galaxy of reasons actually, and many reasons why I think that there is possibly something paranormal about these things. I think it's because my focus has been very broad over the years. I've looked for Yeti-like creatures in 5 different countries, and I've noticed that there are various aspects that keep recurring in the attitude of the witnesses, in the attitude of the skeptics, even in the reactions of animals, and I've had to lose my thread here. Yes, one thing is that I have noticed this, and this takes some explaining, I think. I've noticed that areas that produce a lot of Yowie or Sasquatch reports also produce a lot of other strange reports, like reports of uncatchable black panthers, for instance. Mm-hmm. That's the most common. Or if you happen to be near a body of water, there are likely to be stories of people seeing strange water monsters, like up at Lake Okanagan, for instance. And also quite frequently reports of unidentified flying objects or lights. Also, occasionally, poltergeist phenomena, like rocks sort of being flicked or thrown around, or even showering on one residence that was visited by a Yowie, like so many pebbles falling that it sounded like a hailstorm. That's pretty odd.
Yeah.
The way the creature's eyes at night appear to glow without any ambient light to reflect. They just appear to glow as if lit from within. Many witnesses in North America and in Australia have reported this, and it takes some explaining, at least. Other things are the incredible, intense level of fear that many people experience when they see these creatures. Now, I've seen bears close up, and you get quite a fright. Any large animal that you encounter can give you a bit of a fright, but the level of fear that people experience seems to be way out of proportion to their experience. Several people, and I'm talking 10 or so of our witnesses, or 12 or more, say that they'll never go into the Australian bush again.
Wow.
Unarmed, or if they go in there, they won't stay very long, or if they go into the bush, they feel extremely uneasy and they have to come back out again. All because they saw a Yowie 20 or 15 or 20 years earlier. It's and others say that they have nightmares, recurring nightmares. Women who we've interviewed have burst into tears talking about it. It's something odd. I think it's quite significant. There are many other aspects too that we list in the book.
Exactly.
I want to go on endlessly.
And one side question here I wanted to ask you is, being Australian, obviously, and the famous Australian, I guess he was a naturalist or an animal researcher, Steve Irwin. Did Steve Irwin ever talk about the Yowie or mention the Yowie in Australia?
Not that I know of. Steve was based in Queensland, and poor old Steve, I mean, what a hero, a great guy. I was a real fan, and I had been past his Australia Zoo complex on a couple of occasions. There are Yowie reports within rifle shot of that establishment. I'd be very surprised if he never mentioned a Yowie. No, but as far as I know, no. However, I was, at the time of his death, I was planning to take this book, our new book, up there and see if I could get him to at least market it for us. But there was a fellow prior to Steve, the best-known Australian bushman was Major Les Hiddens, who was known as the Bush Tucker Man. Mm-hmm. That is, he was the army expert on survival in the Australian bush, and tucker is the Australian slang term for food. So he was the bush food man, and he wrote books and guides on how to survive in the bush, and very well-known man in Australia. I've talked to him in recent months, and he is a Yowie enthusiast now. He's setting out camera traps in the jungle in North Queensland, because so many of his army colleagues have seen Yowies.
Huh.
And he also found a classic primate nest up there. And when he was guiding a party of 6 leading scientists through the jungle, it was a classic find, because one of the scientists had recently returned from Africa. And he said, my God, if I was in Africa, I'd say that was definitely a primate nest. So, yeah, unfortunately, poor old Steve is dead. But, yeah.
I didn't mean to be depressing. I just figured...
Oh, no. I mean, he had a great life. I mean,
yeah.
He cheered up. He still cheers a lot of people up.
Oh, I'm sure. I just figured since he was in Australia-based and everything, maybe it would have come up in one of his appearances or something, but I guess it didn't.
Yeah, we should have, obviously, if we'd have known he was going to... I guess we always had that on the back burner. Or one of these days we must go and ask Steve Irwin if he knows anything about this.
Yeah. All right. Well, so what's next for you, Tony? Last I talked, when we were setting up the interview here by email, you said you were heading to America. So that's probably what you're going to tell us now. But what's next for you? What's on your plate here in the future in 2007 for Tony Healy?
Well, yes, it's mainly the trip to America. That'll be 7 months of this year, from late April to mid-November. It's just something. I guess I felt like a bit of a change after so many years of putting this book together with Paul. It's got almost to the stage where I don't want to hear another Yowie report, but. And I'm not getting any younger, as I mentioned, so I thought, well, it might be time for one last big road trip in North America, the US and Canada.
Mm-hmm.
And I've got some good friends over there from my Bigfoot hunting days in 1978, 79. I think I better go and see them before they all drop dead. So I'm looking forward to catching up with all of them. And I'm scheduled to also speak at a Bigfoot conference, Don Keating's Tri-State Bigfoot Conference in Ohio,
mm-hmm.
in, I think it's from the 22nd of October. 22nd of May, sorry. About 21st to 22nd of May, 07. So I'll be speaking about the Yowie there. And then I'll be spending many months touring around, visiting, as I said, old friends, and catching up with people that I have, I know through the email and so on, and visiting all the Yowie, Bigfoot hotspots, and also visiting several of those monster-haunted lakes, which, Lake Okanagan, Lake Champlain, and
mm-hmm.
And so on. I'm really looking forward to it. It'll be a bit of a Rip Van Winkle experience. Almost 30 years. I was a young man when I was over there last, and the Bigfoot research has moved on. There's been new discoveries and new theories and new people involved. So I'm really looking forward to it. I mean, the USA is just always such great value. It's a great adventure for me.
Awesome.
So I'm looking forward to seeing you over there.
Yes. When you alluded to being in Boston, so when you do come around my neighborhood, we'll definitely have to meet up. Sounds like you're going to have quite an adventure here in America.
I hope so, mate. I hope so. Yeah.
Thank you so much for coming on the show, Tony. I really appreciate it, especially being all the way in Australia. Just to set it all up and everything was quite a challenge, but I'm glad we got it all taken care of, and I'm glad you came on the show. The book, which you co-wrote with Paul Cropper, is The Yowie, In Search of Australia's Bigfoot. I cannot talk about how great this book is enough. I can't put it over enough. Not only do you get the history of the Yowie in Australia, but you're also going to get discussion on the hotspots of the Yowie, discussion on the Junjidi, amazing analysis on all these different cases, and look at some of the trends of the Yowie, and various conclusions on what the Yowie might be, and an amazing appendix, 100-page appendix, folks, 300 sightings in there, 282 cases, and 120 eyewitnesses. So Paul and Tony aren't just, putting in 2 cases and then saying, here's the Yowie mystery. You got a whole bunch of cases in there to take a look at and to examine for yourself to find out more about the Yowie mystery. It's just jam-packed and an amazing book that I enjoyed tremendously. So kudos to you and Paul on the tremendous job, and hopefully the Binnall of America audio audience will pick it up and read it. And they can find the book at Amazon.com, of course, and anomalistbooks.com. Either one of those sites will get you on the road to picking up Yowie in search of Australia's Bigfoot. And they can find out more information on you, of course, at yowiefile.com, YOWIEFILE.com. Tony Healy, thank you so much for coming on the show. It's been a pleasure.
Oh, it's been a great pleasure for me too, Tim. Thanks a lot. And I wish every interviewer was as well read as you are. I mean, you obviously read the book very thoroughly and understood it. So it's great to know you appreciated it. I look forward to seeing you in Boston.
Awesome.
There you have it, folks. That does it for this week's edition of Binnall of America Audio. Big thanks to Tony Healy for coming on the show all the way from Australia. It took me a little while to get the logistics lined up for this interview, but we managed to get it done with help from Tony Healy, so big thanks to him again for coming on the show. You can find out more information on him and the book at www.yowiefile.com, YOWIEFILE.com, yowiefile.com. Check it out, and check out the book. Tony Healy, Paul Cropper, co-authors of The Yowie, In Search of Australia's Bigfoot. I can't recommend it enough. Just an outstanding piece of work. Before we dive into the mailbag, let's take care of some in-house notes. For starters, over the break, when we recorded the new interviews, we tried to do it a little bit differently. We got some advice from people who have been listening to the show, who work in the audio field, made some suggestions. Hopefully the audio will sound a little bit better than previous episodes, those of you who are audiophiles and connoisseurs of good sound. In addition to that, we realized that the BOA computer, which was fixed over the break, had been set at a lower internet speed, and as such we realized that we have been underestimating the power of people's download speeds, so we're going to up the bit rate of the MP3s now, so that hopefully the quality will be improved a little more from that as well. And in addition to that, we even got the mysterious voiceover man back in the studio to tape a new introduction to the program so we could get rid of those pops that a lot of people had been complaining about in the introduction. The pops are gone, and I think the way we had the introduction will be how it rolls from here on out. So there you go. We made some improvements to the program here over the break. Hopefully you'll notice them. Moving right along now, of course, it's time for the Binnall of America Audio listener feedback. And this week's letter comes from Timothy Green Beckley in New York City, and here's what he has to say. Regarding your conversation with Greg Bishop pertaining to blacks in ufology, there are blacks in ufology. Bob Urich used to come to almost all my conferences in San Diego and Phoenix, and has even organized conferences in his hometown on Philadelphia. Let's not forget Barney Hill. Can't we count him if we consider that Betty Hill was a UFO author and spoke at many meetings? I can't think of the guy's name, but there is a black contactee from Brooklyn who has been on Howard Stern's show more than once or twice. There was up till recently a show on Time Warner Public Access here in New York City that came on at 2 a.m. and consisted of lectures by various black researchers. Most of it was conspiracy, but they did talk about ancient astronauts and government cover-up of UFOs. One of my favorite sightings involved a buffalo hunter, a black gentleman, who while out one afternoon encountered a landed saucer complete with alien who grabbed his shotgun and bent the sucker like Uri Geller would. The photo was in all the papers. This would have been back in the 1960s. And most importantly of all, Muhammad Ali, who I visited with numerous times at his home and training camp, claimed to have had over 20 UFO sightings, backed up by his trainers and other witnesses. I reported that for the Inquirer and in my book, UFO Among the Stars. Barbara Hudson lived in Harlem. She was a part of Jim Mosley's group and a good friend of mine. She knew Adamski and claimed to have had numerous UFO contacts with the group claiming they were aliens. UFOs cut across every cultural group, my friend. Keep up the good work. The show is always interesting. Timothy Green Beckley. There you go, folks, an answer to the question that we were pondering with Greg Bishop on the Binnall of America Audio Baseball Special, Blacks in Ufology. Timothy Green Beckley, thank you for sending that great information. There's a whole bunch of blacks in ufology that we hadn't discussed yet. Interesting stuff there on Muhammad Ali. and awesome information. So that is the power of BOA Audio. We ponder the question and we get the answers, not just from the guests, but from the listeners. Thanks again for writing in, Timothy. If you'd like to be a part of Binnall of America Audio listener feedback, there's two ways to do it. A, go to binnallofamerica.com, click the contact button in the top right-hand corner of the screen. That will take you to the contact page that has all the information. Or simply write to boaaudio@hotmail.com, boaaudio@hotmail.com. Either one of those methods will put your correspondence on the road to being featured here on Binnall of America Audio listener feedback. Up next, of course, is the thanks. Big thanks to the fantastic binnallofamerica.com staff, Leslie, Chiron, Arlie, Joe V, Ralph Molesworth, and Tina Senna, for your help and support with the audio series and the website. I also want to throw in a big, huge congratulations to Leslie and Arlie, the two newest columnists at UFO Magazine. Leslie and Arlie are now a part of the UFO Magazine, writing monthly columns. As I've been saying, week in and week out here on the program, they are writing some amazing stuff, and I'm thrilled that it's not gone unnoticed by the powers that be in the world of esoterica. Congratulations to Leslie and Arlie. I look forward to reading their monthly columns in UFO Magazine. You, the great Binnall of America Audio listeners, should be checking out their columns at binnallofamerica.com, along with the fantastic columns of Chiron, Tina Senna, and Joe V. BOA is not just a weekly audio show. It is esoterica, day in, day out, fresh stuff at BOA. Check out what we have to offer at binnallofamerica.com and make it a part of your everyday search for esoteric news and opinion. If you're a long-time BOA audio listener or an appreciative newcomer and you want to help support the audio series, you simply go to binnallofamerica.com, click the PayPal button, and make a donation. What you have just listened to this week was part of a 2-hour phone call to Australia. Folks, that kind of thing doesn't pay for itself. I pay for the 2-hour phone call to Australia with help from Binnall of America Audio listeners. If you can make donations, then we can do crazy stuff like this and do great international episodes. We're not a big radio conglomerate. We're a ragtag operation, and we are fueled by the great listeners like you. So, click the PayPal button, make a donation, and help BOA Audio grow and evolve. Next week on the program, we're going to get exopolitical with Dr. Michael Salla, one of the big movers and shakers in the exopolitical field. You've heard many people on the program talk about exopolitics, some pro, some con. Next week, we're going to bring one of the gurus of the exopolitical movement, Dr. Michael Salla, on the program to talk about what is exopolitics, response to the critics of the movement, his thoughts on big UFO stories of the past year, Symington, the French UFO documents, all that stuff. It's going to be an exopolitical, ufological bonanza next week with Dr. Michael Salla. Check out BOA on Friday for the preview of next week's episode. And on that note, we call it a week. It's great to be back. Thanks for listening, folks. You'll be hearing from me next week. Until then, this is Tim Binnall, signing off.